All right, in this video, we'll continue on with the immune system, talking about the cellular immune system, or sometimes called the cell-mediated immune system. And it's called cell-mediated is because cells actually do the work of mediation, meaning that they are the things that are actually performing the immune response. So what do we mean by this? Well, in the cell-mediated immune response or the cellular immune response, you have T cells that provide defense against these intracellular antigens, and they can attack cells that are infected with a virus or infected with bacteria or cancerous cells or any sort of abnormal or foreign cell. And some cells directly go out and kill them. Others release chemicals that regulate the immune response. T cells are a lot more complex than B cells. Remember, B cells just make antibodies, and so T cells have a lot more things going on, and their classification differs. There are two different classes of MHC proteins. If you remember, we talked about these. These are these self-recognizing type proteins. And so there are a couple of different ones that we need to talk about, and they're called class 1 and class 2 MHCs. Basically, T cells only respond to the fragments of those antigens that are displayed on the surface of a cell, and those fragments are displayed by these MHC proteins. They're almost like, imagine them as like little hands that show the thing that is infecting them, or it could be the thing that they ate, depending on the class. And so this presentation, we've talked about antigen presenting cells. Every cell, in one sense, can present an antigen. Some of them are specifically designed to do that, but every cell does it depending on the type of cell. All right, so class 1 MHC, every single nucleated cell, and so this would, like things like red blood cells wouldn't have this, but every nucleated cell is going to have class 1 MHCs. And basically what it does, if a cell is invaded by a virus / bacteria, whatever, that cell is going to present the antigen. It's basically, imagine holding something up like a flag or something and saying, okay, I'm being attacked and this is what is attacking me. And so a class 1 MHC is basically signaling the other T cells to say, hey, come in here and deal with me. I've been hurt. All right. Class 2 MHCs are presented by antigen presenting cells like macrophages. B cells can also present them. And the purpose of the class 2 is so that the helper T cell can come up and recognize that. And so a macrophage eats something that's not supposed to be there. It pulls out that antigenic determinant and it says, okay, here's this thing that I ate. And the helper T cell comes up and looks at it and says, we'll figure this out, and starts to plan a specific defense against that particular antigen. And so that's how those two proteins work. So let's talk about how T cells are activated and how then they differentiate as well. T cells can be activated only when an antigen is presented to them. All right, so see here in this picture, you got a macrophage. It eats this starry thing and it pulls off these little antigens off of it, and now it's presenting those antigens to the world, saying, here, look at what I ate. And that is going to activate that helper T cell, this helper T cell right here, as you can see. And when it's activated, well, first of all, this macrophage is going to release a chemical called a cytokine. And a cyto means cell, kine means like turn something on. And so cytokine turns cells on. There's two cytokines that we're going to look at in the specific immune response. There are more than that, but we're only going to focus on two. And those two are called interleukin 1 and interleukin 2. Interleukin 1, or IL-1, is released by macrophages, and you can see it here on this picture. Macrophage releases it, and it's basically saying, hey, helper T, come over here and look at this thing. And so it stimulates the helper T cell to come over and look at the thing. Interleukin 2 is released by the helper T cell, and it is basically, it activates itself. And so it is a chemical that causes its own cell to do something. Remember, we talked about those autocrine responses in the endocrine system. And so then interleukin 2 also stimulates B cells and other T cells to be activated and go do the thing. The B cells go out and produce the antibodies. These other cytotoxic T cells, we'll talk about what they do in just a moment. Speaking of that, here's some helper T cells, a little bit more about helper T cells. They have two kinds of functions, basically. They work in the humoral immunity and they work in cell immunity. And so in the humoral immunity, remember, humoral immunity is all about antibodies. Cellular immunity or cell-mediated immunity is all about cells doing the work. And so without the helper T cell, I mean, you can kind of see it in this picture too. Helper T cell is right here in the center of all the stuff. If this thing doesn't work, the whole thing breaks down. And so helper T cells are a very central role, literally central role in the immune response. They activate both the humoral response and the cellular response at the same time. And once they are activated, so that antigen presenting cell comes up and shows the helper T cell an antigen, and then they will activate the B cells to produce to start proliferating, which means to kind of spread out and then start producing antibodies. And then they will activate other T cells. They secrete that interleukin as well to recruit those other immune cells. Basically, without a helper T cell, there is no immune response at all. Helper T cells are extremely important in the immune response, and without them, there is no immune response at all. So they kind of play this central role. They go and read the macrophage, and then they go and tell the B cells and the T cells, this is what we're fighting against. Go out and do the thing that you do. Speaking of that, we've talked about B cells. Let's talk a little bit more about these cells called cytotoxic T cells. Sometimes you will see them called killer T cells. Cytotoxic is probably a bit more precise, but killer T cell works. They both kind of tell you what they do. These are cells that actually go out and kill other cells. So whereas a B cell produces a protein, produces like an antibody that goes and does a thing, this is the cell itself going and performing the work. That's why it's called cellular response or cell-mediated response. And so again, cytotoxic T cells, their job is they directly attack and kill other cells. They are activated by helper T cells. They go out and they find cells that are infected by a virus. They go out and find cells that might have bacteria or other parasites. They go out and find cancer cells, as you see this picture here, and they can destroy them. And they can even go out and destroy like transplanted cells. So like let's say you have a blood transfusion that's not a good one, like maybe you have type A and someone gave you type B blood. Well, we've talked about this, right? Those antigens and the anti-A antigens or the anti-B antigens. Well, this is what happens. Your T cells will go out and say, hey, that's not supposed to be here, and they will form a response against them and just go out and destroy those cells, which is not good for that to be happening in your blood vessels, and it can cause some problems. Or if you have a transplant, let's say that you have a kidney transplant, that kidney transplant is not you. It is not your kidney. It's someone else's. Even, they'd have this whole matching process. And I think television has kind of ruined it for us a little bit because, they talk about these things like exact matches. There's no exact match but you, unless you have an identical twin. All right. And so that kidney can only last for a certain amount of time before your immune system eventually just wrecks it. And that's what the cytotoxic T cells will do. So most transplants have a shelf life of like 10 years or so before the immune system basically just goes in and disintegrates that new organ. Cytotoxic T cells work in a couple of ways. They release a chemical called perforin, and think of the word perforin, and you can see here, like that. Think of the word perforate. If you perforate something, you poke tiny holes in it. And so think of a perforin as just basically poking holes in the cell, causing it to blow up. And then also it releases specific membrane receptors onto the target cell, and that those receptors will then stimulate apoptosis in the target cell, and apoptosis is basically programmed cell death. And so these cytotoxic T cells will cause the cells that they are attacking to just basically die on purpose.